you talk about the Southern Miss offense, and we can dive into this. Braylon Braxton coming over from Marshall, he's an exciting player. He is a guy that last year for the Thundering Herd, once he took over as the full-time starter, ended up having a really nice year for them. On the season, about 1,600 pass yards, 19 touchdowns, just 2 picks, 60% completion percentage, just under 8 yards an attempt. Also added 610 yards on the ground and 4 rushing touchdowns. He's a very productive player. He's got a nice arm. He can push the ball downfield and can deliver accurate passes. He's a good playmaker with his legs, which is something State's going to have to contend with. And that's the type of guy that can elevate a team that's could have some question marks. I think they do have questions about who their top guys are going to be skill talent-wise. I think they've got some interesting skill players, as we'll get into here just in a sec. But there are questions about who the top guys are going to be. But they have a quarterback they feel they can trust. They've got questions about offensive line, which is going to be impacting things significantly. But they have a quarterback they think they can trust. So bringing him over as that's the focal point of everything they're going to be doing this season, there's a lot of key guys from that Marshall team a year ago that are not back or that did not make the trip over. But if you were going to have one guy, having Braylon Braxton was huge, and he's going to be a big-time playmaker. And look, this is a Southern Miss offense that I mentioned some of the skill talent. Jeff Pittman, former Mississippi State running back, is a guy that could factor in. I think he's a talented player. Matt Jones also transferred in from Ole Miss. They think they've got some good running backs they can work with. Carl Chester at wide receiver is a Marshall transfer. They've got a few Marshall transfers at receiver, all of whom are going to play. But last year he was a big play receiver and kind of a bigger body guy. Kyron Heath at tight end is a guy they're really excited about and they think could be a really dangerous pass catcher for them over the middle of the field. I think they've got some talented backs. They have a tight end that they can get involved in the passing game. And if you've got having a receiving tight end it compared with, and this is not my own analysis. Shout out to Ian Boyd of America's War Game, who does really great work doing X's and O's stuff, something he talks about a lot. If you have a dual threat quarterback and you compare him with a receiving threat at tight end, that does a lot for your offense because you've got a quarterback who doesn't need the same blocking up front to make things happen in the run game. And then you can have another weapon at the tight end position who can be a mismatch player. Braylon Braxton's a guy who can sort of maximize that and make that happen. I talk about Carl Chester at receiver, but he's not the only one. They've got some other guys they feel really good about. And I'm looking at my Phil Steele right now because I didn't have it all pulled up in front of me. But like Micah Davis and Elijah Metcalf, those are guys that they think are going to be able to be some big play receivers to them. They got some nice bodies on the outside, like guys who can go up and win one-on-one balls. And I think that's going to be a big part of what they want to do offensively. Because when you talk about this offense in terms of what Blake Anderson at OC is going to do, I think it's going to look pretty similar to what Mississippi State wants to run. So Blake Anderson's background, and he was at Southern Miss previously. He was the OC under Larry Fedora back when they had all that success. For a while, he was more kind of in that pass-happy spread offense vein, sort of air raid-esque, but not full-on air raid. And that's sort of a big part of what they did. But over the years, I think he evolved some. And when he got to Utah State, he hired a current Mississippi State assistant, Anthony Tucker. State's running backs coach was hired to be his offensive coordinator at Utah State. Anthony Tucker had been with Jeff Lebby and Josh Heupel at UCF, running the offense that we see Tennessee run and now State runs a version of as well. He took that system and installed it at Utah State. So Utah State, the last few years while Blake Anderson was there as head coach, they were a Briles offense team or a veer and shoot team. That's what they were doing offensively. And I think Blake Anderson, it sounds like, is bringing a lot of that. Now, he was not coaching last year, and he was also not the play caller at Utah State when he was there. It sounds like, though, that's kind of the offense he's bringing to Marshall. He's bringing a lot of the stuff that State runs, which for a State defense perspective, that means you're facing something that you see a lot in practice. But you're going to see they've talked a lot about tempo. Like they are going to play fast and try to run as many plays as they can. Very similar to Mississippi State. They're probably going to use some wide splits with the receivers and get guys out close to the sidelines. Very similar to Mississippi State. You're going to see a downhill run game, similar to Mississippi State, and you're going to see those vertical shots down the field and some heavy dosage of RPO. Those are things. Again, this is the same offense Mississippi State's running. So if you're State, you're kind of getting used to it. Now, obviously, it's a little different when you add a quarterback in Braylon Braxton who has the ability to make plays with his legs like he does. Dealing with that becomes a little bit of a different story, uh, and sort of adds another dimension to what this offense is able to be. But it's a system that I think if you're State, you got some familiarity with. But again, I think they've got a quarterback who can play well in it. I think they've got some good running backs. I think they got the receivers who can win one-on-one down the field, which is a big part of being able to run this system. The big question for them is offensive line. They're looking at breaking in 5 new starters up front, basically an entire transfer class. And it sounds like, reading some comments from Charles Huff, that he hasn't been like fully committal on O-line being in great shape to this point, and how settled that unit is. That's one of those things. If you're Mississippi State, you have to feel like you have a matchup you can take advantage of. If they've got questions up front, and I know State's got questions along the defensive line, but you would think SEC guys can make a bigger impact up front than Southern is able to with their offensive line. You feel like you should be able to have the edge there. Now, again, Braxton's the type of quarterback that can make plays with his legs. So you have to be able to account for that. So even if the protection isn't there, he can maybe make something happen. You also have to account for the fact that, like, hey, you have questions at corner, and your corner's being able to hold up one-on-one. If they're going to send those vertical shots to your receivers, even if the pass protection is not great, is Braxton able to get those passes off, and are those guys able to get by your corners on the outside? Like, those are going to be big questions for the State defense in this. And, I think it's an interesting matchup. I think this Southern Miss offense that can be dangerous and can present some problems, but I hope you would have to hope that State's advantage in the trenches will be enough for them.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's kind of like two sides of a coin. It's like, on one hand, you have what should be an amped up and ready to go defense for Mississippi State, and you have what should also be an improved Southern Miss offense. And they're going to have to face each other, obviously, on the field. And, you would think that, um, hopefully for Mississippi State, they have the defensive advantage, and they can, make big plays in the secondary, get good, pressure up front. They have the guys to do it. And, with that being said, I mean, we definitely need to talk about, this opponent and defense for Southern Miss too. The question is it similar or anywhere near what State's going to have on the field?
Yeah, Southern Miss defensively is going to be a little bit interesting. So Charles Huff, coming from Marshall, brings his defensive coordinator with him. That being Jason Seymour, who was the DC at Marshall over the last 2 seasons. And they were a good unit, one of the better scoring defenses within the Sun Belt. One of the better defenses in terms of generating pressure. I think they were top in red zone defense, very good on third downs, forced a good bit of turnovers, gave up yards. They were a team that they would give up some yards, but they could kind of capitalize on big plays and capitalize on getting stops in the red zone, which a big part of that was they had a terror off the edge in Mike Green as a pass rusher who is now with the Baltimore Ravens. So, that's the type of talent that they don't have. But they brought over some good pieces from that Marshall defense from last season. And look, it's going to be a very different looking Southern Miss defense than we saw a year ago. It's going to be almost an entirely new unit outside of a couple pieces. And they're probably going to be due for some major defensive improvement. You look at some of the guys who are stepping in for them. The big name that transfers over is Josh Monton at corner. 5 interceptions a year ago for Marshall. That's a guy who was a big-time target in the portal. That's a guy Mississippi State wanted, and he ended up, following his coach to Southern Miss. And that's a guy who's a big-time corner for them. They feel good about the secondary as a whole. Nickelback Ian Foster, 48 tackles last year, 5 TFLs, 4 passes broken up. That's another guy that they feel really good about there in that secondary. That's expected to be the strength of this team, is they're going to have talented pieces on the back end, which will likely help them out in terms of being able to go and generate pressure. I think a big part of what Seymour wants to do as DC is to be attacking. If you watch his teams at Marshall, it's not necessarily that they were blitzing constantly. They didn't have to because of some of the because when you got a guy like Mike Green at defensive end and someone who can win like that, you don't have to blitz constantly when you got a guy who can generate that pressure like by himself. You got quality pieces on the Marshall defensive side, 100%. And those guys stepping in for Southern Miss are going to be guys who are impact players. But he does like to bring pressure some. He likes to change up where that pressure is coming from. So you present one look to the quarterback and then change up where the pressure comes from. And you do a lot of that stuff up front. One, because you're trying to mess with the defense, mess with the offense, obviously, and get after the quarterback. But two, you do it when you trust your secondary and you trust that, hey, my guys can hold up in coverage long enough for our pressure to get home. And I think they feel pretty good about the pieces they have in the secondary this year. And even though I don't know if Southern Miss has a guy up front like Mike Green for Marshall a year ago, they've got some guys they feel pretty good about. Bradarius Lewis at defensive tackle is a piece that they have coming back that they like a lot, who had 4 sacks a season ago. Jabari Ishmael is a transfer from Marshall at defensive end that they think is going to be a really nice player for them, who can provide some of that pass rush off the edge. You got a couple linebackers and Chris Jones, who was probably the best player on their team a year ago, coming back, and Michael Montgomery, a transfer from Portland State, who was a really good player. So there's some talented pieces there in that front seven. But I think, again, they feel strongest about what they have on the back end of the defense, and that's going to let them be an attacking group up front. I will point out, though, and this is where it makes sense that they would want to be attacking. We don't have a ton of size along the defensive line. We don't have a depth chart from Southern Miss. They actually are not releasing one this week. That was put out today, that they're not going to put one out, which, of course, that seems very typical for them. Why on earth would we release a depth chart to let Mississippi State know who's going to be playing? But if you look at a lot of the guys they have at defensive line that are expected to step in, you're not talking about a bunch of guys who are 320 pounds out there. It's a lot of guys who are in that 270, 280 type range, if not less. Now, you can have guys that size that are still very talented players. You have guys like that who can be great pass rushers, be good disruptors. And if you create enough havoc up front with changing where pressure is coming from and doing some stuff with your stunts up front and your twists up front, those are ways that you can create pressure even without having a big dominant force who's just going to, muscle his way past an offensive lineman. And that is sort of going to be a little bit of the MO of what they want to do defensively. That said, you feel like State should have a physical edge against Marshall, and you feel like they should be able to find some success on the ground, which brings me to an interesting point. When you talk about I think I kept saying Marshall against Southern Miss. When you talk about State, it's basically Marshall's defense, though. That's essentially what we're talking about here. But when you talk about State being able to have success and maybe do so on the ground, what I look to the last 2 years at Marshall, when Seymour was defensive coordinator, he has seen this offense. He saw it 2 years in a row because Old Dominion, who Marshall played, runs this offense. Well, in those 2 games in 2023, Old Dominion scored 35 points, 434 yards at over 8 yards a play. They had 339 rushing yards and almost 11 yards per carry. 2024, 35 points, 517 yards at 6.7 yards per play, 286 rushing yards at 6.2 yards per carry. They got gashed on the ground, a rushing average of 312.5 yards per game rushing. When facing this offense, the Marshall's DC gave up over 300 yards a game on the ground. Now, Marshall won those games mostly because their offense put up 40 points. If you score 35, man, you should feel pretty good. But obviously, sometimes you got to be able to win a shootout, and Old Dominion couldn't do enough. There are also some turnovers in those games. Neither game, Marshall was able to throw the ball. Old Dominion was able to throw the ball particularly well on third down, and that really came back to bite them. If they got in the third and long, they ran into some trouble. But when they were able to just not make mistakes, they killed them running the football. Now, yikes. Yeah, that's the correct way to put it. You're talking about 300 yards a game on the ground. I'm not saying Mississippi State's going to run for 300 yards in this game. I don't know. But what I do know is the track record for Southern's DC in defending this system, albeit in a pair of wins, but the track record for him stopping this system has not been great, particularly in rush defense. And also, for what it's worth, Marshall last season, rush defense as a whole, was not very good. they got away with it. They found ways to get stops in the red zone. They found ways to force turnovers. Like they were able to make it all work. But rush defense was a little bit of an issue for them, especially going up against this offense. And we think Mississippi State, with the guys they have on the offensive line, the size they brought in there, with the talent they have at running back, I think they're going to want to be able to run the football. And I'm not saying they're going to go and just line up and just hand the ball off willy-nilly, like no matter what, we'll just always run the ball. But I think if they get looks to run the football, they're going to want to go and impose their will, and I think they probably will get those looks. Now, it will be a question, if Southern likes their secondary, can State's receivers test those guys when you get those play-action chances? That'll be a question for you. Can your pass protection hold up? If you do go sit back and throw. You're wondering about that. But again, Southern does not have a single pass rusher I look at and say, man, that guy is terrifying right now.
Yeah.
I think if you're State, if you can stay ahead of the chains and you can run the ball well on them, you should have an edge here. I think this is a defense, even with some talented pieces, I think State's got to have a chance to take advantage.
Absolutely. Really talented pieces for Southern Miss. And one guy that stands out to me, at least in terms of some numbers he had last year, and he seems to be, first off, he's a senior, and maybe you mentioned him, I'm not sure, but Brodarius Lewis is a senior. He's 6'2", 295, had 4 sacks last year, was able to get after the quarterback, was able to stop guys in the backfield. One of the key anchors of that defensive line with 19 tackles on his own last year. Big guys like that for Southern Miss. They're not that team that could just pull out the 300-pound guys, but they could still make the 290, 295 work. And guys like this are kind of proof of that. And those are going to be the guys that I think Shapen and company on offense have to be careful about when they go up against this team this week.
T. Watley pointed out with Albert Reese at left tackle, they don't have to be too terrifying. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute because State did release the depth chart. We want to get into that and just give our reaction. We'll get that before we get into breaking down Mississippi State's matchup here. But, yeah, look, I think Southern Miss, this defense has some talented pieces for sure. They're going to be better. You got Josh Munn at quarter's a good player. You talked about Lewis up front. He's a good guy. They got some talent at linebacker. And something I heard listening to Scott Watkins, who covers Southern Miss for Sun Herald, he talked about, they think the frontline guys, it should be a really good unit. The question will be depth. And I think if you're Mississippi State, that's another thing, can you look, we're probably talking about a high possession game. Southern wants to push tempo. We know Mississippi State wants to be able to push tempo as well. If you have to get into depth, who has the edge? And you feel like Mississippi State should have the edge both offensively and defensively in terms of getting into depth. But we talked about it a lot with State's defensive line, or it's been the topic of the offseason, is they think they can rotate bodies up front. They think they can rotate bodies at linebacker. I don't know if Southern's able to yet at those positions. And if you're State, you feel like you got a chance to wear them down. Should their wins come with some asterisk regarding the opponents they have played last season, depth chart comparison, State is a better team on paper. Look, State absolutely has the better team on paper. I'm not going to question that at all. But look, there is some talent on that Marshall team that's now in Hattiesburg. I keep calling them Marshall because they're basically Marshall. There's legit talent there, though, that is now in Hattiesburg. Like Braylon Braxton is a good player. Josh Monson is a very good player. And some of the receivers, I think, are talented guys who are going to be able to be impactful. There's a few other pieces they added on defense who are solid guys. This is a group that is going to be much improved for sure. There's no doubt about it. It's just a matter of, depth-wise, I don't think they're there. And something I just talked about that with the depth in terms of being able to wear them down. Something I just keep thinking back to is we talk about the offensive and defensive lines. And I can't say this for State's defensive line for a year ago, but going into last season, State's offensive line, the feeling a lot of us had was, well, we're worried about the depth, but we think they brought in 5 good pieces at transfers who can come in and start for them. We think they're going to have a solid starting 5 along the offensive line with the transfers that they added. And it didn't happen. That offensive line didn't work out because the pieces that came in just didn't come together the way you want them to. I'm hearing similar things with Southern Miss in that, well, we like the 5 guys we brought in up front. We like the guys we brought in along the defensive line. And it's like, okay, but they're worried about depth. How certain, though, are you that those starting guys are actually going to pan out? How certain are you that your starting offensive line is going to come together? How certain are you that your starting defensive line is going to come together? Because, hey, Mississippi State, we've been there, done that. We've seen it, and that's tough to overhaul in an offseason if you don't already have a foundation in place of solid guys you can lean on. We now go into year 2 for Mississippi State, and we talk about State's offensive line, and it's like, okay, yeah, there's a lot of transfers here, but they've also got some guys they've worked with. They've got guys who have played. They know what they have. They have some solid pieces there. State's defensive line, it's tough to say there's a lot of solid pieces there, but it does sound like some guys have had some good off seasons of development. You know they got a lot more depth, and the talent in that room is improved. You feel like they've got a lot of guys that can play. I don't think Southern's there, and we'll talk about matchups later when we get into the predictions, but that is a key thing for me matchup-wise. The trenches, I do think State, both sides of the line of scrimmage, is going to have a big edge, and I think State's going to be able to wear them down physically. I do worry about some of the playmaking ability Southern has. I will be interested to see if State's able to test their secondary. They need to be able to. But those are big things to look at for sure.
Yeah, I think, and I'll probably reiterate this later when we do our picks and predictions here, but I would think that Mississippi State offensively is going to be that team, at least in this game, that just says we're not the best, but we're better than what this team's putting on the field defensively. Now there's going to be some challenges, obviously, but I think it's one of those things like I'm trying to think of how I want to put this, but like can Southern Miss have that defense that can play some ball against Mississippi State? Sure, absolutely. The question is, can you keep up with them for 4 quarters and 60 minutes? I doubt that. And again, we'll talk about that when we predict the game and everything. But just to go ahead and throw that out there, how I feel, like I don't think Southern Miss is going to be a team that can wear you down defensively for 4 straight quarters. Maybe half a game, maybe an hour or a quarter and a half or something. But I don't see how they keep up even with the lower tier offense in the SEC like Mississippi State, and not to dog on Mississippi State, I'm not, but let's call it where they are right now. Even on a team like that, I think the big question for me for State's defense or for Southern Miss's defense is can they keep up for a 4-quarter game? And I just don't think so.
Yeah, look, it's definitely fair. And I think that is the big matchup here to watch. Like Southern Miss offensively has guys who can make plays, but can State with what they have up front on their defense get after them enough to limit them? I think they can. Southern Miss defensively has some talented pieces on that front line, but you talk about over the course of a 4-quarter game with all the tempo that's going to be run between these two teams, all the plays, it's very clear what State already has the physicality edge up front just based on the body types that are going to be there. State has a significant edge when you talk about depth. So when State's having to roll their second and third stringers out there against Southern Miss's offensive line, an O-line and for Southern Miss that has question marks, for that for sure. Like State's gonna be able to take advantage, but also the Southern Miss defense against State's offensive line. You feel like State's got guys who should be able to impose their will a little bit, and if you can wear them down some, you can get after them. And of course, I mean, look, it doesn't just want to be a wear them down game. You want to hit those explosive plays down the field as well, and I think those chances will be there. But it does feel like this is a game where State's just going to have a pretty significant edge in the trenches, despite the talent on both sides of the ball for Southern Miss.